You are not allowed to speak. You are not allowed to move. You are not allowed to pray, unless he permits it. You sit on the cold floor of a chapel that does not echo. Not even your breath bounces off the stone. It is midnight again. It is always midnight here. Beyond the heavy door, you hear the strings, slow, seductive. Then the low hum of voices, laughter dulled by velvet curtains, and secrecy. You imagine the clink of wine goblets, the rustle of silks, the scratch of a fingernail across bare skin. You imagine them because you have seen them before. You were once permitted to attend, but not anymore. They wear masks now, always masks. No names, no titles, just bodies in motion, swirling in candlelight, unmoored by consequence. And you wear chains, not the kind that clang or bruise. These are quieter, a chain of vows, of expectations, of royal decorum. A chain that wraps around your ankles in the form of sacred duty, around your throat in the form of a husband's decree. You try to remember the last time you heard your own voice, the last time someone looked at you without bowing, the last time someone touched you without a script. A mouse scurries across the chapel floor. Even it is free. You are his queen, yes, crowned before the eyes of God and men. But your crown is made of thorns, hidden beneath pearls. Your throne is a cage with velvet cushions. You close your eyes and try to imagine your homeland, the sea, your mother's voice. But even memory feels like rebellion now. You were brought here as an offering, a bride to make peace between kingdoms. But the masks never had to bow. The masks never had to bleed. The masks never had to pray. Only you. Her story was never written in the royal records. Only whispers in corridors, rumors tied to the sound of chains behind chapel doors. This is not a tale you'll find in the official histories, but it happened somewhere between the masked pleasures of a king and the silenced prayers of a forgotten queen. And it's not the only one. At Echoes of the Past, we search for voices that were buried beneath marble and gold. We follow the soft footsteps of women erased, of lovers hidden, of truths locked behind ornate doors. If you've ever felt haunted by the weight of stories that were never told, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Echoes of the Past and help us unearth what history tried to silence. And if you're listening from across the world, from Istanbul to Indiana, from Cairo to Kyoto, tell us where you are. Because history belongs to all of us, even the parts they tried to forget. It was an empire gilded in shadow. In the early 1700s, at the heart of a kingdom that praised God by day and worshipped flesh by night, power rested in the hands of a king whose desires shaped the very rhythms of court life. His palace was vast, marble halls, endless corridors, stained glass that softened the sunlight until even noon looked like twilight. But the most sacred space, the most whispered about room, was not a chapel, nor a council chamber. It was a ballroom, sealed to outsiders, opened only after dark, and only to those who wore masks. There were no invitations, only selections. The king's men chose quietly, carefully. Daughters of dukes, sons of foreign guests, servants with porcelain skin or knowing eyes. All were invited into the midnight masquerade. None were to speak. All were to obey. No name was to be uttered. No face revealed. It was not called a harem. Not publicly. The court preferred more elegant words. Private audience, devotional rite, the circle of reflection. But everyone knew what it was, and everyone feared being excluded, or worse, included. The king himself was a paradox. a scholar of theology by morning, a devotee of pleasure by night. He saw no conflict between the two. The body, he once said to a bishop, is the soul's rehearsal space. The bishop said nothing. He did not need to. The crown needed no permission. The queen, meanwhile, was a woman of entirely different metal. She was not born in this land. Her homeland was colder, sterner. Her upbringing was rigid, forged in prayer and diplomacy. She had been trained to rule, to listen, to speak 6 languages, to ride, to resist scandal. Her marriage was meant to bind empires, a sacred alliance between nations. Her arrival had been celebrated with trumpets and incense, but celebration faded fast. Within a year, she was no longer invited to the king's private dinners. Her chambermaids were replaced with informants. Her letters went unsent. Her freedom of movement was trimmed like the edges of her gowns. She was told her health was fragile, that she needed solitude and stillness, that it was best she remain in the western wing of the palace, close to God, far from politics. Her chapel was beautiful. White stone, gold leaf, incense that clung to the skin like a second scent. But its doors locked from the outside, and the windows were too high for even moonlight to enter. The rumors began slowly. She chose a life of prayer, some whispered. She was touched by visions. Others said she went mad. But most simply nodded and said nothing. The queen, like many royal women before her, had disappeared in full view. What most did not know was that her isolation was not spiritual. It was strategic. The queen had once asked too many questions. She had objected to one guest being invited twice in the same week. She had spoken openly about the need for reforms. She had raised the matter of masks. And so, she was given silence. This was not unusual. Throughout history, royal women who questioned the order of pleasure were labeled difficult, hysterical, unwell. Power was preserved not just by sword or scripture, but by room placement, access control, symbolic chains. The king's masquerades continued. They grew more elaborate, more mythic. New rules were invented. Some said participants had to strip in the shape of saints. Others claimed the masked guests were asked to confess each morning to a special confessor, one who could not see them, only hear. And all the while, the queen waited. She lit her own candles. She kissed no one good night. She learned the creak of each floorboard in her stone chapel. She learned patience like a weapon, and she never once removed her wedding ring. In portraits, she smiled. In court appearances, rare and choreographed, she bowed and blessed and said nothing. But if you looked closely, you'd notice. Her shoes were never muddy. Her skin was always cold, and her eyes never reflected the light. The silence did not come all at once. At first, it was soft, barely noticeable. A letter misplaced, a dinner postponed, an audience rescheduled. The queen, Elira as she was once called in her homeland, did not question it. She had been trained to endure royal delays, to smile through reshuffling, to make excuses for others with the dignity expected of a monarch's wife. But then, her harpist was dismissed. No explanation, no replacement. Then her confessor was changed. The new one never looked her in the eye. And then came the mirror. One morning, she noticed it was gone, the tall, gilded standing mirror in her private chamber. In its place was a tapestry, a scene of the Virgin Mary kneeling, her hands bound in prayer. The queen stared at it for hours, unsure whether it was meant to comfort her or warn her. She asked the chambermaid, The maid said nothing. She asked her steward. He bowed and disappeared. Elira was not stupid. She had read the histories. She knew how women in her position were gently erased, not by blade, but by absence. She began to write letters to her brother, a prince in the north, to a former lady-in-waiting, to a bishop she had once trusted. Weeks passed. No reply ever came. And still, each day, something else vanished. A book, a comb, a pen, a servant who dared smile too long. By the time her voice was taken, informally, unofficially, by glances and gestures, she no longer needed confirmation. The final confirmation came during a feast, not one she was invited to, of course, but she heard the music, the laughter, the smell of wine and roasted meat drifted all the way to her western wing. She followed it cautiously, a lone figure in velvet, her crown slightly askew. She reached the corridor outside the grand hall and stood behind the curtain. She saw nothing, but she heard it. Laughter, sighs, the slap of skin on skin, a breathless voice murmuring prayers that did not belong to any god. And then her husband's voice, playful, gentle, whispering words he had not said to her in years. That night, she returned to her chapel. She closed the door, and for the first time, she locked it from the inside. The first time Elira saw the masks, they unsettled her, not because they were grotesque, but because they were beautiful. Smooth porcelain, ivory, gold, and jet. Each mask molded to an ideal. Soft cheekbones, small mouths, narrowed eyes. None bore expressions of pain or doubt, only stillness, elegance, lust without consequence. At first, they were worn only during royal entertainments, formal galas, winter solstice rituals. Elira herself had been given one, a simple white half mask that covered only her eyes. The king said it made her look less rigid. But then the masks began to linger. Not just at night, but during the day. Not just for dance, but for dinner. Guests arrived wearing them. Some never removed them. Servants began whispering that the king preferred not to see faces anymore. That identities only cluttered pleasure. He introduced a new rule. No one was to speak unless spoken to, especially in the West Wing. Elira was not addressed for 3 weeks. When she entered a room, silence followed, not reverence, absence, as though she were a spectre interrupting a dream. The grand hall was redesigned. Curtains were hung where walls had once been. Candles replaced torches. Music was played not by orchestra, but by hidden musicians behind silk. The guests did not dance. They floated, touched, moved with studied detachment. Those invited to these evenings were handpicked by a royal steward no one dared name. Each arrived at dusk and departed at dawn, their faces still hidden, their garments perfumed with oils that clung to the air for days. And the queen? She was instructed to remain in prayer, to fast, to reflect, to remain untouched. She was told this was for her protection, that the king's spiritual journey required balance, that her purity was necessary to anchor the kingdom's moral axis. Elira did not scream. She stopped asking questions. Instead, she began to observe. From a narrow slit in her chapel's wall, she could see the pathway leading to the east wing. She memorized footsteps, counted how many entered, how many staggered out. She noticed that some returned frequently, others never returned again. One night she watched as a figure paused before the chapel wall, masked, head bowed. The figure reached out, touched the stone with trembling fingers, then vanished into shadow. She wondered, did they know she was there? Or were they simply praying to a wall that had become holy by rumor alone? In time, the masked rites evolved into doctrine. What began as indulgence became ritual. What began as pleasure became liturgy, a secret theology of flesh. They called it the reflection, a belief that each masked union cleansed the soul by unbinding the body, that anonymity was purity, that the surrender of self, of name, of will was a form of holy devotion. And the king, once merely its architect, was now its priest. He no longer attended councils, no longer read dispatches from the outer provinces. He spent hours in the Hall of Lanterns, a room remodeled into perpetual dusk, where masked acolytes knelt in silence, their breaths rising like smoke. There, he listened to whispered confessions spoken without identity. There, he gave absolution in the form of silk ropes and perfumed oil. A whisper spread through the court. The king has found divinity in the faceless. Elira, however, was never invited to observe the reflection. She was told it would interfere with her spiritual calling. Instead, she was assigned a chaplain, a man with gentle hands and no eyes. Blinded in war, he was said to hear sin like music. He asked Elira only one question, again and again. "Have you surrendered your name yet?" She never answered, but something inside her began to fracture. She spoke less, moved slower. Her body, once trained for diplomacy and pageantry, felt useless in silence. Even the warmth of the sun, when permitted in her chambers, felt borrowed. One day, a maid entered with a gift, a mask, white silk, trimmed in sapphire, a crown of thorns embroidered above the brow. Elira held it in her hands, cold and feather-light. She understood what it meant. It was not a gift. It was an invitation, or worse, a command. She placed it on her lap and said nothing. The maid left. The mask remained. It would sit there, untouched, for 7 nights. Until finally, on the 8th, Elira rose before dawn, took it to the chapel's brazier, and burned it, slowly, deliberately, until only ash remained. When the ash cooled, she smeared a line of it across her wedding ring. A private sacrament, a silent war. They did not drag her. They escorted her, with ceremony. At dawn, on the day the kingdom celebrated the Feast of Saint Obedience, Elira was brought from her bedchamber to the Chapel of the 7 Veils. Her gown was white, her veil was red. The procession was silent. They said it was tradition, that queens, in times of spiritual uncertainty, must undergo the vigil, a sacred retreat of 7 days and nights, alone, to reflect upon their station, to purify their thoughts, to realign with divine purpose. No queen before her had ever needed it. But Elira was told she had grown too still. That stillness invited decay, that her spirit required gentle refinement. They called it mercy. The vigil chamber was unlike her private chapel. This one was older. No windows, no candles. Only a brazier lit twice a day by silent monks and a cot made of unpolished stone. There was a book, blank. There was water, rationed. There was silence, absolute. A single bell rang every 24 hours. That was all. On the 3rd day, the chain appeared. Not iron, not locked. It was woven from cloth, embroidered with prayers, designed to be wrapped loosely around the ankles during moments of reflection. A symbol of tethering, they called it. So the soul does not wander too far from humility. But Elira knew symbols wound tighter than shackles. She rapped it once, then twice, let it sit there as she knelt, but she never tied it. Each day, she waited for a voice, not from above, not from the monks, from within. She began to speak, to herself, then to the walls, at first in whispers, then in liturgy. But she rewrote the liturgy. She said, "Blessed are the silent, for they will hear themselves." She said, "Woe to the masked, for they know not who weeps beneath." She said, "If the king is God, I am the ghost in his chapel." No one listened, but the walls remembered. On the sixth day, she received a gift. A folded parchment slipped beneath the door. No seal, no name, just a single sentence. "You are not alone in your clarity." She read it 5 times, burned it, inhaled the smoke. That night, she did not sleep. She counted heartbeats. She peeled open the seams of her cot. Inside, she found nothing. Nothing but silence, and something in her chest that no longer resembled fear. It was day 7. They arrived again, hooded, robed. They offered her a mask, as they always did. She did not touch it. They offered her absolution. She did not kneel. They asked if she was ready to be seen again. She answered, "I was never unseen." When Elira emerged from the vigil, her footsteps made no sound. She was thinner, paler, but her eyes were steady. She spoke when spoken to, nodded when required, smiled just enough to appear composed. But never again did she laugh. Those who saw her at court claimed she looked ethereal, like a marble statue that had somehow learned to breathe. And perhaps that was the intention. For soon after, her presence at public functions was reduced. Official portraits no longer featured her. Her title, once included in royal decrees, was quietly removed. But she was not dismissed. That would have made a noise. Instead, she was reframed. The kingdom began to refer to her as the Silent Queen, a name spoken with reverence, as though she had chosen seclusion as an act of divine enlightenment. A book was published by a court scribe, Meditations from the West Wing, allegedly based on Elira's private prayers. It included lines she had never written, doctrines she had never believed. But the mask of her piety was now more useful than her truth. Inside the palace, her chambers remained lit, but no one saw her walk the halls. Whispers began again. Some claimed she had gone blind. Others said she had taken a vow of non-speech. A few believed she had died and been replaced by a servant trained to mimic her gestures. Only one thing was known for certain. She was no longer invited to the reflection. Not even as symbol, not even to observe. The king, meanwhile, flourished. Publicly, his masked rites became more stylized, more sacred. Foreign visitors described them as the theater of surrender. Paintings were commissioned, faceless bodies entwined beneath archways, veils fluttering like wings, the king depicted as a divine conduit of ecstasy. He began referring to himself not as ruler, but as resonance. In one illuminated manuscript, he was shown with a crown hovering just above his head, untouchable, like a halo. Elira read the manuscript in private. She tore out the page. That winter, she vanished. There was no announcement, no mourning, no funeral, only a change in routine. Her guards reassigned, her chapel sealed, her name omitted from the court calendar. A single line appeared in the royal archive. The Queen has taken permanent retreat for matters of the soul. No date, no explanation, no record of location. Later, when a new queen was crowned, one of the masked, unmasked at last, no one dared ask what became of Elira. But in the hidden corners of the palace, servants whispered of a figure seen pacing the abandoned chapel. A woman in red, barefoot, her fingers stained with ash. Others swore they heard her voice in the walls, reciting verses no priest dared translate. Years passed. The king grew older, but not quieter. His rites continued, evolving into spectacles of myth and flesh. His lovers came and went, always masked, always unnamed. The people still cheered his festivals. Foreign dignitaries still bowed before his philosophy of pleasure as transcendence. But in private, something had begun to rot. The western wing, once lit for ceremonial silence, fell into disrepair. Servants refused to clean it. Monks assigned to its chapel left their posts without explanation. Even the guards stationed outside began requesting reassignment. They claimed to hear humming, low, steady, like breath, echoing through stone. And sometimes, late at night, the king himself was seen walking toward that wing, alone, always returning pale. He never spoke of Elira. He never said her name again. But one evening, during a celebration marking the 12th year of his reign, a page was found in the throne room. It had not been written in any known hand. The ink was faded, almost as if scrawled in ash. It read, "I wore no mask. That was my crime." No one claimed it. No one investigated. But the next day, the Hall of Lanterns was closed, permanently, and the king withdrew. He ceased appearing in public. His rituals stopped. His sermons about transcendence ended. He ate in silence, slept in silence, refused to be touched. Eventually, he ordered all portraits of Elira destroyed. What remained were copies and the memory of her silence. Then one winter, the king died. No public mourning was held. The palace announced a return to traditional values. A new queen was crowned, though few knew her name. The masks were locked away in a vault no one could find. But long after his tomb was sealed, rumors lingered. In the archives, a single portrait of Elira resurfaced, unsigned, unframed, hidden behind a false panel in the chapel library. She stands barefoot, one ankle wrapped in silk, one hand clutching a burning page. Behind her, a door, slightly open. No guards, no chains, just ash trailing like a path. We often imagine that masks are things of the past, symbols of ancient courts, secret rites, distant kings. But we still wear them. We wear them in the profiles we curate, in the roles we play, in the silence we maintain to survive a room, a relationship, a system. We are taught still to choose which parts of ourselves are safe to show. And when a woman refuses the mask, when she dares to remain fully visible, fully present, without performance, without apology, she is called difficult, fragile, dangerous, or worse, she is forgotten. Elira's tragedy was not just exile, it was erasure, not just confinement, but reframing. Her silence was repackaged into sanctity. Her resistance turned into ritual. Her absence renamed obedience. And in that, she became a myth. There are many Eliras. They work in boardrooms. They kneel in prayer halls. They sit across dinner tables, wondering how they became ghosts in lives they built. They are told, "Be grateful." They are told, "You are protected." They are told, "This is tradition." But no chain is more enduring than the one dressed as virtue. and no prison quieter than the one that teaches you your voice is unworthy of hearing. So perhaps the story of Elira is not just about a queen. Perhaps it is about every woman who refused to disappear, every soul that burned its mask and waited for the ash to speak. She left no final letter, no monument, no lineage, only silence. But sometimes silence echoes louder than decree, and sometimes the absence of a woman becomes the most damning testimony of all. If Elira's story moved you, if you felt her footsteps, heard her breath behind the chapel wall, then perhaps you're part of the reason her memory still survives. Because history doesn't just live in stone and scroll, it lives in those who are willing to remember. So I ask you, have you ever known an Elira? Have you ever been one? Tell me in the comments. Share this story with someone who still thinks obedience is the same as devotion. And if you'd like to hear more of what history tried to bury, subscribe to Echoes of the Past. We are a growing community of listeners, of seekers, of those who believe that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. Thank you for staying until the end. May we all learn to unmask gently, and may no one ever have to burn in silence again.